Okay, we're back for another new bike day review. This time it's featuring the Ripmo AF. The Ripmo AF I've ridden now in 3 different locations. So I've ridden it on cross-country trails in my own hometown. I've ridden it at Moose Mountain in southern Alberta, just outside of Calgary. And I've also ridden it at Revelstoke on the actual bike park. So I've had a little bit of opportunity to sort of test it out in the 3 types of environments that it's actually going to be used in. So Moose Mountain has a little bit of everything. Revelstoke, obviously bike park, very high speed. And in my local trails here in Edmonton, lots of undulating trail, all up and down, all XC focused. Unlike my Ripley AF video, I didn't talk about the build very much. So I do want to spend a bit of time on that here because it actually is much more relevant with this particular bike. So as you'll notice, I do have a Fox 38 on the front of it. That is not the fork that comes stock spec. Now, when I bought this, what was listed on the website was that it was going to be selling with the DVO Onyx. It did not show up with the DVO Onyx. At some point, they had changed the spec over to a Bomber Z1 coil, which is a pretty significant difference, at least in my eyes. The weight penalty for the coil is not insignificant, and I did want this to be a do-it-all bike. I wanted it to be a little bit of a lighter weight build. And in retrospect, maybe I should have done a 36 up front instead of a 38, but I had a chance to ride a 38 earlier in the season, and I just loved the feel of it. So it was pretty much a no-brainer for me. That was going to be mandatory for my next bike. I sold the Bomber Z1 coil and bought this instead. In this particular case, I also swapped out the bars. I did want the P&W range bar for the extra 1 degree of back sweep. That actually made a big difference to me. I didn't think that 1 degree was going to do that much. I really do like the Ibis bars at 9 degrees of back sweep that just come stock on the Ripley. Like that's what I've been running there the whole time. But I actually really do prefer the P&W bars. This is the SLX Ripmo build. So SLX Drivetrain, SLX brakes, and I'm actually very happy with the SLX shifting. Although hilariously, like, yeah, I'm saving a little bit of weight, but truthfully, the Dior stuff shifts just as well. I honestly, in some ways, I wish I had just bought the Dior build kit, but the big difference there is that you don't get the bike yoke dropper, and this bike yoke dropper is actually incredible. So it's a 170 drop, and it's buttery smooth. The lever is great. The lever action is great. It's just worked flawlessly, and I've been so happy with it. Another thing about the spec here, it did come stock with 2 Assegais. And mostly just for rolling resistance, I didn't really want to run 2 Assegais, so I did DHR2 on the rear. And in retrospect, the DHR2 is a pretty draggy, like it's a pretty high rolling resistance tire, and it's also fairly heavy as well. So I didn't save a ton by going that route, but I have to say the braking performance on the DHR2, especially in steep stuff, is incredible. My rear end was able to just dig in and always find traction, didn't matter how loose. And I was just unbelievably impressed with what was going on there. It was fantastic. With the Assegai, it's just got consistent cornering across the entire radius of the tire. So no matter where you are leading the bike over, there's always something to corner with. And that consistency in the front end also fully blew my mind. I've been really, really happy running that front tire for the couple of rides that I've had a chance to get out on the bike. So let's talk about spec criticisms. I think the only actual spec criticism that I have, and obviously this isn't based around the Bomber Z1 coil because I never rode it. I just sold it new right out of the box. So I can't speak to that, but I will comment that the SLX brakes, tons of stopping power, but I do find that they require a little bit more effort to get that power. So for me, I did get a fair bit of arm pump, especially in the park where I was doing a lot more braking. But regardless of that, I'm still incredibly impressed, and I think because I was able to get this on part of that huge 25% off sale that they're doing on all of their Ripmos. I don't know if that's still going on or whatever, you'd have to look into it, but I did get an incredible deal. So value is definitely one to consider on this one. You'll notice that I don't have any pedals. I actually had an issue with the pedals that I had to warranty. So I got the 1-Up alloy pedals, and they worked really, really well for the first couple of rides. And I was super impressed with the platform in particular. Like I really like that platform. But after riding half a day in Revelstoke, which was only my 3rd ride on the bike, the bearings were completely shot. You couldn't rotate the pedals at all. When I took them apart and opened them up, there was visible bushing wear all over the spindle. Like it was a mess. I can't really endorse the 1-Up pedals as a result of the experience that I've had so far, but I do need to wait until I get the warranty pedals to properly judge how they're gonna perform. That's all I really need to talk about as far as the spec is concerned, so let's get into climbing. Climbing with this bike, I've heard a lot of very good things about the Ripmo, both as a platform and the Ripmo AF specifically as being a very efficient climber. And a lot of people have told me, you know, the Ripmo AF doesn't lose much to the Ripley. Well, I ride my Ripley every day. Let me assure you, it loses a lot to the Ripley. This does not pedal nearly as well as the Ripley. It doesn't climb nearly as well as the Ripley. It is not the Ripley. It's a significantly heavier bike, right? This build, I actually don't have a weight on it. I haven't had a chance to weigh it yet, but it's no slouch in the weight department, especially the 38 is a heavy fork. To slap that on there, the Assegais are beefy tires. So it's no shock to me that there are some weight penalties that come along with this, but to my surprise, I did the Stoke climb at Revelstoke, for example. Now, I'd never done that climb before. That was my very first time hitting that climb, but I've ridden more steep and more demanding climbs on my Ripley, and I have to say, I was in my granny gear the entire time on that climb. Like, the effort that it took me to get this bike to the top of the hill was significantly more than what it would take me to get my Ripley up there. So to those who say the Ripmo doesn't lose much to the Ripley, and maybe that's true in the carbon iterations, but in the AF iteration, that weight is incredibly noticeable, especially when you're pairing it with the kinds of tires that you want to run on an all mountain bike like this. I'm already trying to figure out how I can shave weight to improve climbing performance without having to lose the tire combo, because I really like this tire combo. So it's either that I'm gonna just have to get stronger, which is likely the outcome, or it's that we're gonna have to, you know, maybe look at carbon rims or something like that. But that's such an expensive upgrade, and it's not something that I wanna do. The other thing about pedaling performance that is definitely worth mentioning, if you're gonna be riding some cross-country trails in there, the front end, or like the whole bike is longer, the front end is slacker. All of these things combine to just make it more work on tight, twisty single track. You really have to set up wide to get that front end in, or if you're picking the front end up, you have to be aware that it's a heavier bike also. So in general, this bike is way more fatiguing to ride. It's a bigger, burlier, heavier bike, and you have to be prepared for that when you are riding it. Now, for descending, to start, I want to talk about my descending at Moose Mountain. That was my first ride on the bike ever, like period. I just took it out there, and we weren't climbing, we were only shuttling. So I didn't have to worry about the pedaling performance of this bike, and that wasn't factoring into the feelings that I had about this bike. For suspension setup, I set it up all stock according to information I could cobble together from Ibis and from Fox. I do want to talk about that DVO shock a little bit. This Topaz, I really do like how this shock feels. It's incredibly supple. However, this is the 2022 version. They made a bunch of changes to it, including the way that the bladder works and the pressures that the bladder is supposed to run, but neither DVO nor Ibis have an updated guide to tuning this shock. So it was incredibly difficult for me to get it dialed in, and in fact, I still think there's a lot of room for improvement, but when I was at Moose Mountain, it performed incredibly well just with the stock setup that I was sort of able to put together from a couple of different sources using DVO's website as well as using the Ibis setup guide. I did get a pretty usable shock setup for that particular ride. And then for the fork, it was actually just butter. I was very, very happy with the fork at Moose, but it did start to show its weaknesses when we got it over to Revelstoke. So in Revy, the rear end, I really noticed a lot of harsh bottom outs. So what do when you have harsh bottom outs? You increase the pressure. I just continued to increase the pressure more until I was running close to 200 PSI and I was still occasionally clanging it out. So obviously that means I'm gonna have to look to tuning some of the spacers in here. As for the fork, this is my first Grip 2 fork, so I did struggle with setup a little bit. When I got onto the bigger mountain and there were really high-speed braking bumps, it was very harsh feeling. I could not get it to feel plush. I also couldn't use all travel, so I do think I'm gonna have to pull one of the volume reducers out of there. I'm not sure if it was packing up and then I ended up more in the mid-stroke, or I'm not sure if it ended up being a situation where just because of the amount of ramp in the chamber, I wasn't getting the travel that I needed to sort of help smooth it all out. I really don't know. There's still some tweaking that I have to do there, but for the first couple of rides out, it's definitely been a challenge to get that fork to feel the way that I wanted it to. So yeah, this is just a first impressions, right? Obviously, there's still work for me to do to make sure that this bike is riding to its full potential, but I will say things to keep in mind. Definitely the weight. It is a heavier bike. If you want to be pedaling this bike a lot, it might not be the best call, but again, it's an aluminum frame and the value is incredibly good. And I will say that even though I'm struggling with some of the setup on the fork and everything for very specific, like a very narrow bandwidth of high speed, chattery sections, for the rest of the time it performs incredibly well. If I have one criticism about the frame itself, aside from the weight, is that the seat tube angle is too slack. It's a 76-degree seat tube angle. If it was even 1 degree steeper, I think we would be in a much better place as far as overall body position. It just makes it a bit easier when you're climbing up steeper sections to stay centered, to stay seated. You don't have to get up. You don't have to throw your body weight forward, drop your chest all the way to the bars to make sure that that front wheel isn't lifting. If I'm gonna have one additional complaint that I have neglected to mention, you can't do a full-size bottle. So that's a little bit of a bummer. I would love to have a 750 in there. Unfortunately, just be aware of that there is a limitation on your carrying capacity for fluids. I do think this bike corners incredibly well, and it's something that I absolutely should talk about. With the shorter rear end, the power of the brakes, and the traction in the tires gives me a ton of confidence in just being able to throw this bike into corners in a way that I've never felt confident doing. Like it really is a game changer, and I think both at Revelstoke and at Moose Mountain, I just had a giant shit-eating grin on my face the entire time. First impressions have been good. It's definitely a good bike. Not without flaws, but a good bike to be sure. And again, the value, especially if you can get 25% off, man, that's a great value. So for me, knowing that I now have part spec that I can carry forward to another frame down the road, and for the time being that I do have a pretty capable bike, even though it may not be my favorite thing to pedal in the world, we get used to these things pretty quick. We can adjust to pretty much anything. So in the long-term review, I'll be able to tell you just how much I was able to adjust to this, if at all. So until then, see you next time. A quick little tag on the end here. Thanks for sticking around to the end. I hope that you enjoyed that review, or that first look anyway. I do want to add a couple of quick things. So first of all, I want to apologize for not having more riding footage in this video. And I know, especially as a guy who watches a lot of reviews, I think it's really important to see how the individual who is reviewing the bike, how they ride, so that you have some context for what exactly it is that they're putting the bike through. I think that's important. And so I have to apologize for not having that included here. My GoPro died. I haven't had an opportunity to replace it. Obviously, the bike set me back a little bit. So I just haven't had the space in my budget to deal with it. So it is something that will be coming, and ideally I'll be able to get some more riding footage, but it is going to be a little bit more of a wait. So I'm sorry that I wasn't able to include that. And the last thing that I want to do, just before we call it quits, I want to thank Hardcore Bikes. They're the store in town, my local, that brought the Ibis Ripmo AF in for me. I really appreciate all the help they gave me in getting the extra components and everything put together onto this bike. And just in general, I really like working with those guys. They've been great. I'm not sponsored by them or anything. I'm just giving them a shout out because I appreciate the work they do for me. So anyway, thanks very much. We'll see you later.